Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. A bit of false advertising introduction there. It's not RAF week, it's RAF Day. We've got one show coming your way before I take a break to go and do the April World War II TV Normandy tour. And if you are interested in taking the October Normandy tour, get in touch. Plug out the way. 80 years ago this month, the RAF suffered its worst ever night with staggering losses bombing the German city of Nuremberg. Dan Ellin is back from the International Bomber Command Center to talk about how the raid is remembered, with copious mentions of scarecrows. And if that reference means nothing to you, you'll find out what it means very shortly. So, good evening, Dan. How are you today?
I've been better, but yeah, I'm all right. And happy Easter egg day, everybody.
Happy Easter egg day. So, we were just talking before going live, about Masters of the Air and Bomber Command and what we would do if we were given, $100 million to make a film, and what stories are right for the 2024 audience. And this is what we're going to be discussing today, is that the Nuremberg raid is something that's gone through different kind of levels of introspection and criticism and appraisal, and that's one of your things. Before we bring up your slides, you're kind of big on that historiography and public memory, and
cultural memory.
Why does that aspect of it kind of draw you rather than obviously you have to know how many bombers were there and where do they take off from, but the popular memory aspect, why does it float your boat?
That's a good question. It's partly because I'm working in the IBCC Digital Archive with the University of Lincoln, and it's sort of where my work fits at the moment. I think if I was in a different department at the uni, I'd probably be more straight history, but it just happens that that's the kind of thing. In a nutshell, I think James Jeffries talks about this as well. When Bomber Command is remembered by the sort of lay person rather than the person who's really into the history of the bombing war, it's easy to do this binary. It's easy to do. It's either the Dams raid and heroic sacrifice, or it's Dresden and disaster for the people on the ground, and then you get lost in the rabbit holes of ethics and morality. The Dams raid is nice and easy to remember. It's because seemingly they were attacking a concrete structure. They weren't directly aiming to kill people. They killed a couple of thousand people on the ground, but it was sort of collateral damage rather than actually aiming to kill the people. Whereas Dresden, they were aiming to create a firestorm. So you get this heroes or villains kind of binary. Nuremberg is kind of talking to both of these operations, in that the hook with talking about Nuremberg is more RAF personnel died in that one night than did in the whole of the Battle of Britain. So it's easy to see Bomber Command as the people who suffered. The bomber veterans, the bomber crews were the people who suffered. There were I think it was just under 100 people killed on the ground. So, thinking of the effectiveness of the bomber campaign, it would have really been better for RAF Bomber Command to have stayed at home that night. So when people are accusing Bomber Command veterans of being the bad guys, it's Nuremberg is the raid that is remembered to counter those claims, because it's like the film Memphis Belle. You never see what happens on the ground, really, and everybody is out to get the crew of the aircraft, and everything that could possibly go wrong does go wrong, and that's exactly what happened on 30th, 31st March 80 years ago.
There we are. So we'll go over to you, and I know, Dan, you welcome comments and questions to go along, but basically let's hear your presentation, folks. Just keep the sidebar as it always is, interactive and knowledgeable, and I'm looking forward to this.
Okay. Well, you want to move on then, Woody?
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about what it says on the screen. I'm going to talk a bit about the events and the historiography. Put the operation into a bit of context, and then talk about a couple of cultural representations, which I find really interesting. No means least, this one. It's probably the book that got me into the history of Bomber Command in the first place. I think, look, wrong way. When I was a kid, I was Conrad. Now, obviously, I'm more like Joe Pikey's dad. But so yeah, few cultural representations, how Bomber Command and this operation's been remembered, and then I'll talk a little bit about how that pays on into veteran interviews and the stories they tell. So just the picture on that slide was a 50 squadron length from Skellingthorpe, which was lost on the operation. It's one of the few colour images that we have in the archive. So yeah, if you can do the next slide. So according to Bomber Arthur Harris, the Nuremberg operation was the last operation in the Battle of Berlin, which went on through these dates. The Battle of Berlin followed on from the Battle of the Ruhr, which ended in, which was March-July 43. And Harris famously said about Berlin, we can wreck it from end to end if the Americans come in on it, and it will cost about 500 aircraft. So Berlin was the main target between around November 43 and January 44. As I say, Nuremberg was seen to be the last of this sort of phase of the bombing campaign. Harris said that he could wreck Berlin from end to end if the Americans would come in on it. The Americans didn't, and RAF Bomber Command ended up flying more sorties, more operations onto Berlin than Harris had originally intended, with the help of the Americans, and they dropped more tons of bombs than he intended that they would have to. And of course, the Nazis didn't surrender. They didn't wreck Berlin from end to end. It didn't finish the war. This is also kind of interesting in that the period from June 43 to June 44 was the only period during the war that Bomber Command flew solely night operations. For the rest of the war, before and afterwards, they flew a mixture of day and night operations. It's a really tricky period for Bomber Command, basically because the Luftwaffe are on the up. It's like the radio countermeasures, and when you're thinking about tanks and armor-piercing shells and armor, it's a conflict between the scientists and the backroom boys as to who's going to win, who's going to have the best bit of kit. And following on from Hamburg and the RAF using window for the first time, the Luftwaffe were totally at a loss during the Hamburg operation, but then they thought, hang on, we need to do something different. We need to change up our game. And prior to the use of window, they had been guiding one fighter onto the bomber stream using their radar, and obviously window put the end to that. So what they did instead was, rather than having one fighter that would be led into the bomber stream onto one bomber, they had freelance flights. The night fighters were out, patrolling and looking for the bomber stream, and they would, if they could, the Luftwaffe would put a Ju-88 or whatever into the bomber stream that would shadow the bomber stream all the time on the radio, saying where they were, and then other fighters would converge. And this worked really well with its wild boar and tame boar fighters. The fighters would be told to circle a beacon until the route was clear, and then they'd all be vectored in, following the running commentary from the operators on the ground. Of course, the RAF tried to counter that by having aircraft with German speakers on there. They were trying to send up, tell the Luftwaffe pilots false information. The other things that they did as well was, they would fly above the bomber stream and drop flares to light up the route. And of course, on the night of Nuremberg, this worked really well. In fact, on the night of Nuremberg, lots of RAF aircrew were so sure that the Luftwaffe could not have found out the route, that they were thinking that it was, it had been leaked. There was a spy somewhere that had. No, they thought that they were ready and waiting for them. It's just the German system worked better than the RAF one at this time. Also, during this period, 3 Group Sterlings were taken off German operations, and Mark II Halifaxes, because the chop rate, the rate of attrition on those aircraft was just so high. I think Sterlings were averaging about 6% attrition rate, and some Mark II Halifaxes it was about 9%. I think one night 102 Squadron lost about 18%. So it's that was about 20% of the aircraft that Bomber Command had at their disposal had to be taken off for, German operations, long-range operations in German territory. I've illustrated it with this slide again because I asked my daughter to draw this for my previous talk, and it's just illustrating this idea that Harris was kind of fixated on trying to see if Bomber Command could win the war by bombing, and his idea that he'd rather lots of Germans died than put one British Guardsman at risk. Effectively, what he ended up doing was putting all the RAF lads at risk. But about this time, the Battle of Berlin, Bomber Command effectively lost around 1,000 aircraft and crews, which was pretty much their frontline strength. So this was totally unsustainable. They were trying to do everything they could to make it work. The bomber stream was a lot tighter. So early in the war, the bombers would set off for a target, and they would the target would be bombed for a couple of hours. Whereas this period of the war, they were in and out. 70-mile bomber stream would be over a target, over a city, and away in about 15-20 minutes sometimes. Morale was suffering, so you get all these stories about fringe merchants who drop their bombs on the outskirts of the target, drop their bombs early. You get people talking about there's rumours of people who would drop their cookies early so they could gain a bit more altitude. You get stories of some people dropping the bomb loads over the North Sea even. And the other thing that they were doing with the Halifaxes and the Stirlings that were taken off bombing German targets, they were sent out to do sort of diversion spoof raids. So operations to targets nearer the coast, so they didn't have to spend so much time over German territory, and mining operations to try and fool the Luftwaffe as to what the target was. But on the night of Nuremberg, this didn't work. The Germans didn't take the bait. They didn't fall for the diversions and the spoof raids. And yeah, so the Battle of Berlin didn't do what Harris intended, because he was hoping it would go some way to winning the war and proving that what Bomber Command could do. Bomber Command pretty much lost the Battle of Berlin. They lost their full strength over the period pretty much. So the Battle of Berlin, like the Battle of Britain, was won by the fighters. And being taken off the bombing German cities and onto the prep for D-Day just about saved Bomber Command.
You mentioned D-Day there, and for those who just fresh off Masters of the Air, there's the big bit in there where the 8th Air Force was explaining that the policy is changing to taking out the German Air Force rather than necessarily about the target. It's about making sure the Luftwaffe come up and we can knock them out there. What does Harris and Bomber Command? How are they related to that kind of overview general plan?
I mean, that was the plan. It was that point blank. I can't remember. That was the plan. Harris, always a bit of a maverick, would do things if he was expressly ordered to, but if he could sort of do what he wanted, I think he chose to do that, and he was convinced that Berlin was the thing to do, in the same ways that he'd wanted to destroy German industry in the Ruhr earlier. So yeah, he couldn't justify keeping Bomber Command going to Berlin and to the German cities in the run up to D-Day. So it was one of the times when he did as the Air Ministry and High Command wanted him to do it, and it had to be done, really. I mean, there was no arguing it for that. And I say that moving from targets deep in Germany with deep penetration, so you're flying over German home soil for hours, did save Bomber Command really, because they went from flying 8-hour operations over Germany to 3 or 4 hour operations over France and north coast of France. Incidentally, a lot of the memoirs and a lot of the veterans and some of the written evidence shows that some COs decided that an operation to France in support of starting preparation for the Normandy campaign didn't count towards a full operation. So if you've been one sortie, one op over Germany would be 8 hours. If you were only doing 3-4 hours over France, that only counted as half an operation, or even a third of an operation. Didn't go down very well. And Bomber Command veterans even today are still talking about that injustice. There's a bit of a catch-22. First of all, we want you to do 25 ops, but then it's 30 ops, and then that one doesn't count as a full operation. So it's just another interesting aside.
I'd hate to be the bloke who has to go into that room and tell a crew that have just come back, by the way, that only counts as half a mission.
Yeah. I have seen in some logbooks that it's recorded as a fraction of an operation, and it is mentioned in memoirs and interviews, and they weren't very happy with it.
Wow.
I've yet to see where that came from. There's so many of these things that I don't know whether it was a sort of bottom-up thing that was some COs on some squadrons just went with, or if there were orders for it. And there's more of that to come. So thanks for moving on. Nuremberg, the actual operation. This is the map taken from Franklin and Webster's official history, and it shows the route that the bombers took. So they flew out. The top line is the way out, and the line at the bottom is the way back. The little crosses are where aircraft were shot down. So this was during a period of full moon. Actually, the moon was quarter of the way through the phase, so the moon was actually half the moon. It wasn't gibbous where it's more than half, and it wasn't a full moon. But the moon was up, and it didn't set until after they bombed the target. So all the way they were in bright moonlight. The forecasts were wrong. They said that it was going to be cloud over the route and then clear skies over the target. It was exactly the opposite. And lots of people, including Don Bennett from the Pathfinders, didn't like the route, didn't like the idea that they were going to fly such a long leg, 260 miles in one straight line. And they argued with Harris that they shouldn't operate this night, or if they did, they should do a different route. But the operation wasn't cancelled. 795 aircraft were took off for the target. The Luftwaffe night fighters and some day fighters assembled at 2 beacons along the route until they could. Well, they just happened to be close to the route until it was clear where the RAF were going. They weren't fooled by the spoof raids, by the diversion raids. And to make matters worse, because it was really cold, there was snow on the ground. It was one of those occasions where the aircraft were creating contrails. So they were silhouetted by the moonlight against the white clouds beneath. They were creating contrails that were just arrows pointing here as an aircraft. And then the Luftwaffe were also dropping fighter flares, so big white flares on parachutes. Some of the stories say that the Germans had a new flare, which they were calling pawnbroker flares, because there were 3 sort of glowing balls that just hung in the sky. The bomber stream was about 68 miles long. It took 17 minutes to get over the target. That was a theory. But they were effectively sitting ducks. 83 aircraft were lost on the outward route, so 95 in all, which I think was 64 Lancs and 31 Halifaxes. So 545 men were killed. RAF personnel were killed on this operation. It's 11.9% chop rate and the attrition rate, which was, as it turned out, that was the greatest loss that Bomber Command had during the whole war. It followed on from some horrendous losses. I mean, Leipzig, a few weeks before, was the worst one, but they also lost similar sorts of percentages, well above 9-10% on some of the Berlin operations as well.
And we had the question earlier, Dan. Losses represents the aircraft lost, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So crew of 7. Some of them, some of the crew might bail out. I don't think anyone actually evaded from this. I think they were all taken prisoner of war if they survived bailing out. As well as everything else, the winds were wrong. The weather forecast was totally wrong. So I think 120 aircraft bombed Schweinfurt, which was about 50 miles northwest of Nuremberg. So clear skies all the way to the target. When they got to the target, it was cloud covered. So the pathfinders dropped marker flares, red with yellow stars. These were Wanganui sky markers. So again, these are flares that are hanging on parachutes. And that's a target photo that's from the archive of the shot that was taken just after the bomb release. So underneath those clouds is wherever those bombs fell. But to say, the bombing was really, really scattered. The creep back was about 10 miles, and several aircraft, to say, bombed the wrong target. The look didn't change. On the way back, they were flying into the wind, and one crew got very upset with the navigator because they asked him how long it was going to be before they crossed the English coast, and he was in the middle of doing his sums, doing his maths, and he said about an hour. And they asked him about an hour later, and he'd actually done the maths by then, and he said it's still going to be about an hour. He worked out that although the airspeed was normal cruising speed, because they were flying into the wind, they were actually doing about 70 miles an hour across the land. Wow. So Cyril Barton's crew is probably worthy of mention. He won a VC on this night. His aircraft was attacked by a night fighter. Several of his crew, I think including the bomb aimer and the navigator, bailed out because they thought they were going down. He then managed to gain control of the aircraft. They bombed. He headed back. He was based up north. I've forgotten the airfield, but they were flying back to their station and getting very, very low on fuel because they were just sort of making up the route. And he ended up having to crash land because they were too low. They couldn't find an airfield. He was aiming to crash land in a field, and he held it up at the last moment to avoid some houses. And he was killed and won the VC for his acts over the target and for not crashing into the houses. But the 2-3 remaining crew on board, they survived. So that's just another one of the fantastic stories that's out there. So that's the raid. If you can change the slide, I've got some pictures of how the story was reported the following day. The Nazi radio, Lord Haw kind of thing, they reported that the 135 British aircraft had been shot down, but as that was them exaggerating it. The BBC and the print media basically told the story, but with a bit of spin that it's night battles. Yes, it was a big loss. Yes, the defence was really, really strong, but the plucky chaps fought their way to the target and gave it a good pasting. The bombing was accurate and they carried out the duty, sort of thing. The Times reported that the target was destroyed. It's really wasn't. I think these are snippets taken from the Daily Express. The other thing that is really interesting, and you mentioned it at the start, if you click to the next slide, please. I find this really fascinating because this was the last night of March, and the next day is April the 1st, April Fool's Day, and scarecrows is the first mention of scarecrows in the British press that I can find. So I've highlighted, they also used a new type of scarecrow rocket fired from the ground, which went up like flares, hung in the sky and burst and scattered. Scarecrow flare is a German bluff. And this is a photograph taken from the Daily Express from about a fortnight later,
right,
of supposedly a scarecrow flare exploding. So the story is the Germans had this new weapon, either a scarecrow flare or a rocket or a shell, that simulated a 4-engine bomber exploding in midair. And the idea was it wasn't a bomber exploding, it was just something that looked like it to put off the crews. It was meant to sort of dissuade them from carrying on. But of course, the Germans had no such thing, and it came out after the war that they had no such thing. And whenever anybody saw something that looked like a 4-engine bomber exploding like that, that's what they were seeing. I've only ever seen anecdotal evidence that air crews were talking about them before Nuremberg. If anybody can find evidence of a scarecrow in any, official document, ORB or anything before Nuremberg, I would love to see it. This is a bit of a work in progress. I'd love to spend some time in Kew seeing if I can find an order that came down from the Air Ministry saying to the air crews, saying to the intelligence officers, tell the crews this story. But I've also, we've got people talking about them in the archive who admit that they thought this idea up themselves, or they convinced themselves that this was true. So it's really quite interesting. There's the same picture as this one. This was taken from the newspaper, but there's a better copy of this picture in the Australian War Memorial Archive. Although I find it quite funny in that I think in the Australian War Memorial, the picture's upside down.
Okay. I was going to kind of make a really bad pun about Australia and being upside the other side of the world, upside down, and what is upside. But I'm not going to. But you can. Viewers can do that themselves.
Yeah. So in this photograph, you have the clouds at the bottom of the photograph, and the aircraft are flying above the clouds, and then there's this big bright flash. And in the other version, it's the other way up. So it's just another interesting aside. There's another chap in the archive, a guy called David Dole. He said we were told afterwards that there were oil bombs that blew up in the sky to frighten us. He was on 101 Squadron. 101 Squadron lost 7 aircraft on that night. So scarecrows, are part of the story of Nuremberg. If you read the historiography and memoirs and these sorts of things, people say that air crews were talking about scarecrows before Nuremberg, but I'm not convinced. No,
it'd be a really interesting paper for you or James or someone to look at. World War II food technology, but only the technology as released to the public at the time, not the real technology that we know various air forces were using, but because there was this kind of public propaganda war, wasn't there, of the both sides kind of excusing their own lack of results by the enemy having something really cool, and then conversely, explaining that you had good results because of the big bit of kit you were using, and it was a kind of a chess game of who's got the best kit, but used in very clever ways by the press.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, it's been covered a bit in the chats I've listened to about Masters of the Air. What's different about the bombing campaign is the guys who are over Germany, either in the daylight or at night, the next day are in the pubs mixing with the local population, and they're telling their stories. And at debriefing after coming back from Nuremberg, the crews were saying to the intelligence officers who were debriefing them that they'd seen so many aircraft exploding, and they were being told, "Don't be silly, you didn't." And also on the operation themselves, the crews were telling themselves, "Just stop recording these now. That's too many."
Wow.
And there had to be, I think, a story to counter these tales that aircrew might be saying in the pubs and telling their friends and their families, I saw this many aircraft exploding. I think with it being told in the press the following day, I think there is that bit of sort of plausible deniability that they said they saw so many aircraft explode, but a proportion of those were probably these Scarecrows.
Just a quick question for you. Trent Telenko, our resident radar expert, and he's talking about, and I'm going to pronounce some of those words, the Luftwaffe's countermeasures, which you kind of touched on earlier on. In your kind of Bomber Command archives, do you have much from what the Luftwaffe were understanding of what the British are doing, or do you mostly have what the story told from the British or Commonwealth Bomber Command point of view?
It is mostly from the Allied perspective. However, we are interested in the entire story of the bombing war from both sides. So if anybody wants to get in touch with any documentation or can put us in touch with people to talk to, that would be absolutely wizard, because we want to be telling a more balanced story.
There you are, Trent. Reach out to Dan, share some of the information you've got there, and that point of view of what the Germans were able to do at that point in the war is fascinating and valid.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple of interviews with some German night fighters, and we have a few bits of Luftwaffe documentation, but not as much as I would like. So yeah, always after more. So that was Nuremberg during the war, and immediately afterwards, after the operation. Just realised we've been chatting for half an hour, so I'll rattle through the next slides. My colleague Heather Hughes has written a really interesting paper about the memory of Bomber Command, and I recommend people go and find it online and read it. The story, it's an easy story to tell that Bomber Command were forgotten immediately after the war, didn't receive any recognition for it, and it ties in with the politics of Churchill and the bombing of Dresden and everything. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that the chaps didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to get on with their lives and get back to semblance of normality. And Bomber Command was remembered. It was in the public eye. So we've got the Dam Busters book by Paul Brickel, and then the film, and then with Appointment in London. So they're in the cultural memory. And they're also semi-official. I mean, this is a window from Lincoln Cathedral that's commemorating Bomber Command in the cathedral. I've forgotten the date now when this came out. 1954. So there are memorials. Bomber Command is being recognised. It is being remembered.
I would also add, Dan, we've talked about this, Alan Allport and James Jeffries. It's the great British public and the Canadian and Australian, New Zealand public as well are also deciding what they selectively about what they want to remember as well. It's not that there's necessarily a conscious effort to push anybody out. It's the public tend to remember the things they want to remember. And, we've talked about it so many times. The memory of the Spitfires and Hurricanes over Kent in 1940 was a glorious memory to hold on to. And the idea and notion of bombing civilians, and it's a bit murkier. So it wasn't necessarily things were suppressed. The people will decide what they want to remember themselves individually and kind of collectively, I suppose.
Yeah. And there's also what's visible. I mean, fighters over Kent leaving the pretty contrails is very visible. What Bomber Command were doing at night far away isn't so much if you're in the UK or Australia or Canada or whatever. So it's I mean, interestingly, immediately after the war, the bomber crews went on what they called Cook's tours. So they would fly at a couple of thousand feet over the targets that they'd bombed to see what they had done, and lots of them were absolutely astounded by the damage that they'd caused on the ground. So 50s and 60s, Bomber Command it's not brushed under the mat. It's not forgotten. It is remembered, but in specific ways. I think we also have to sort of consider that there's this, the 1960s were also a time of looking back at the First World War and the concept of lions led by donkeys.
Yep.
And I think there's an element of that starts to creep in, just, not criticizing the crews, but perhaps some of the decisions that were made by Harris and Portal and Churchill.
And perhaps, especially when we get towards the latter part of the 60s, although the UK not involved in Vietnam, but sort of a global kind of anti-war sense. You look at the war films that were coming out in the 60s. It was anti-war generally. It wasn't anti-bomber command. It was anti-humans inflicting death on each other. So you have to tie all of these things together to get a kind of a understandable view of this historiography and public reaction, which is what we're talking about, I guess.
Sure, yeah. And then, of course, 63, the official history of the strategic bombing of Germany is released, and that has a bit of a mixed response. Thanks, James. So, moving on to some of the historiography. This is specifically looking really at the Nuremberg raid. Webster and Franklin don't really address it. It's just another operation in part of the Battle of Berlin. That's the first thing. And they talk about the unsustainable losses by Bomber Command during this period. And Nuremberg is mentioned in the book because it draws a line under the Berlin, the Battle of Berlin. Yeah, so it's the end of the phase of point blank against what's supposed to be against the Luftwaffe fighters. And the start of Overlord preparation and the transportation plan. Middlebrook is pretty much the definitive book to go to. It's the book to read about this. Go and read it, folks. That's the one. Taylor is really interesting. I mean, it's really interesting because of the cover and the title, The Nuremberg Massacre. So this is the massacre of aircrew. 5 times more Allied airmen were killed than Germans and civilians and workers on the ground. So that's what the massacre is. And the cover doesn't really pull any punches. It's a skull with a flying helmet on it. Me and my colleague were trying to work out. He's Robin at the archive. His background is in archaeology and paleontology, and he's thinking, I think that's the 16th, 17th century skull, but rather than but just the cover of that says it all, really. Taylor was a pilot on 207 Squadron. He was shot down and became a prisoner of war. He was a prisoner of war before the Nuremberg operation. And he spoke to a lot of survivors in the POW camps. And then afterwards, he sort of did, he put calls out for people to contact him and tell him their stories. But this was mostly through written. And the blurb of the book, he says he's offering a retrospective and therefore a more objective look. It's a really interesting book. I think it's best when he's talking about his experiences. So when he's talking from his perspectives as a pilot, albeit before March 44, of what it was like on an operation, that really rings true. The rest of the time, it's a good history book that he's pulled in all these different stories and sources from different aircrew. What's really interesting, this came out in 1980, and he and all the veterans that he spoke to for the book all buy into the Scarecrow myth. They all believe the Scarecrow myth. There's a footnote in his book that says scarecrows were a product of the Scarecrows were a product of the ingenious minds of the German psychological warfare specialists. They were flat shells which, on bursting, simulated an exploding British bomber, complete with blazing, dripping petrol, flares, and signal cartridges. The effect was more than enough to startle and dismay inexperienced crew. Several of the people you interview now talk about it wasn't just any bomber that was being hit; it was specifically a Pathfinder bomber that was being hit. If you saw a Scarecrow, because some of the pyrotechnics would be the marker flares going up, and all the different colours of those. The last couple of books, we got John Nichol's Red Line. Again, the title is because it's the red line from the long straight run from France and Belgium across to the target. John Nichol's work, it's sort of after the cultural turn where we're less interested in the sort of official top-down perspective that you get with Webster and Frankland, and it's more to do with the veterans and storytelling, and his work is based on oral history. I had a phone conversation with him it was towards the end of last year, and he said, he set out to try and write a bestseller history book based on interviews. And I think he has a bit of an advantage when he's interviewing veterans, because he has a sort of similar shared experience being a navigator and shot down and being a POW. They sort of
good point.
Me, they see a long-haired hippie, and I have to prove that I know what I'm talking about before I can get anything really sensible from some of the veterans. And some of the volunteers have done interviews with us. There's some really, really good people women who have interviewed veterans, and their sort of way in is a little bit flirty, but all these different ways work. But John Nichol's book is a really, really good sum up of the Nuremberg raid as well. The last chapter is really interesting because he's talking about Christopher Panton, who was killed on this operation, and that led to the creation of the museum at East Kirkby and the home to Just Jane. So Nuremberg 80 years ago now sort of led in effect to one of the wonderful aviation heritage sites that there are in Lincolnshire, or in the UK. The last book, Nuremberg, The Blackest Night, I'm afraid I can't read it. I bought a copy, so it's on there. But I really wouldn't recommend it. Again, if we're thinking of titles, it's a bit ironic that it's called The Blackest Night, because actually the night itself was one of the most bright moonlit, cloud silhouetted against cloud contrails, kind of fighter flares. As night operations go, this might as well have been a daylight operation. There's still the good books out there. I've not included Dennis Richards' Hardest Victory, Max Hastings, John Terrain's Right of the Line. So there's lots out there. These are sort of the pick, I think. But the go-to one is definitely Middlebrook.
Yeah, what else? Middlebrook is the definitive book on Arnhem, I think. Probably the definitive book on the Somme, the definitive book on this. I mean, he passed away last year. Was it early this year?
Yeah.
Recently, anyway. What an incredibly important historian.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
You're right. Okay. So telling the story in the 70s, Middlebrook came out in the 70s. I want to talk about Conrad's War, and I want to talk about Brylcreem Boys, which was a radio, a BBC 2 drama that was first shown 1979, written by a guy called Peter Durrant. There's also Dayton's Bomber, which, although not about Nuremberg, is fairly groundbreaking. Came out in 1970. Tells the story of a bombing operation. It's a fictitious bombing operation, but it does it really well. Tells it from multiple perspectives and shared suffering. There's victims on both sides of the war. It talks about the horrors of war. It's non-judgmental, the shows that the history and the way that the war and the bombing is remembered is contested. There are different conflicting sides to telling the story. There's also The World at War, the TV documentary. But this is The World at War. Although they've started getting in the viewpoints of surviving bomber crews and Luftwaffe night fighters, is very much still a top-down kind of thing, because they're interviewing wing commanders and people at the top rather than the everyman. There's no mention of Nuremberg in The World at War, but they do talk about the Battle of Berlin, and they do say that Bomber Command was severely mauled and lost 1,000 aircraft. This slide, this is a screen grab from the Brylcreem Boys, and we've got a very young-looking Timothy Spall, and throughout the TV show, they do lots of the little details that come up when you interview people, or the details that come up through memoirs. The superstitions of peeing against a tail wheel and taking your girlfriend's knickers on board as a superstition, a good luck charm. All those things are there. It's really interesting. The Brylcreem Boys. It's most of a bomber crew who are in hospital with psychiatric problems, and they reenact when night falls. They reenact the Nuremberg raid. I'll talk a bit more about that in another slide, because I think the next slide's Conrad's War, which I've already held up my copy. So this was written by Andrew Davies. It's sort of about a relationship between him and his son. His son was a sort of typical 10-year-old boy in the 70s, was mad keen on the war, and his father was a bit, more of a pacifist. And it's sort of autobiographical between him and his son. I had a conversation with him about it. It's a wonderful story. It's more than a kid's book. If we had money to make a film about Bomber Command, I would want to see this made. I think this would be absolutely brilliant. Conrad, the little lad, he builds his Airfix model, and he sort of dreams that he flies it over, and it's the Nuremberg raid they go on. He admitted to me that he was influenced by Middlebrook. A lot of the stuff that's in the scenes in the book are taken from Middlebrook. So it tells the war from different perspectives. There's a wonderful scene set in Colditz where none of the prisoners of war can be asked to try and escape. They're just happy to live out their life and wait for the war to end. And why do anything? So that's Andrew Davies' sort of perspective. There's the French resistance in there. There's a Tiger tank in there. There's an ambulance full of dead and dying and wounded people that sort of shows the horrors of war. But when he's talking about the Nuremberg operation, he's hitting all these tropes that people still talk about. So there's no Scarecrow Shells in there, but the air crew, really come across as suffering, as being victims. So the quote there, Nigel Creamer, he drops his pipe after the briefing and he's shaking and he doesn't want to go. So there's sort of a nod towards lack of moral fibre in there. Blaming Harris. Harris is sort of both Conrad's school headmaster, but also Bomber Harris as well. And then also, after he's bombed the target, Conrad starts having these thoughts. He was told in the briefing that Nuremberg was a city about the size of Leeds, and he thinks, my gran lives in Leeds. How would that be if bombs started coming through her roof? He's starting to have these thoughts, these ideas in the back of his mind. So it's looking at the war from different perspectives, but it's also it's like the Memphis Belle. Everything that could go wrong does go wrong, and everybody is out to get them. So the bit he didn't want to clang over backwards and disappear from view, that's a couple of pages when he's thinking, I'm flying along in this Lancaster above the clouds really, really slowly, and it's like when me and my dad went to the shooting fair and there's little metal ducks that are going across the screen really, really slowly, and all you have to do is lead them ever so slightly and you can just bang, 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 knock them all down. And he's thinking, oh, crikey, I'm one of those ducks. So literally a sitting duck. He doesn't want to clang over backwards and disappear from view. So there's lots of stories that are in this, which is aimed at kids that are about the sort of examples of the way that the bombing war is told, how the veteran stories are told. And as I said, talking to Andrew Davies, I think a lot of this came from Middlebrook. So that was 78. If we go to Brylcreem Boys, 1979, Scarecrow Shells appear in this, and that's where the title of my talk came from. One of the crew is looking at another aircraft and he's watching it, and then it explodes, and someone says, oh, look, there's a scarecrow. And he says, scarecrow be buggered, that was a Lank exploding. It was shown as Play of the Week in 1979 on BBC Two, and then it was repeated in 1981. Now this is in 70s, 80s, when there were 3 TV channels. I think it's a couple of years, even the repeat is a couple of years before Channel 4 came on. It's a time when the Bomber Command veterans sort of retirement age, I guess. I think lots of them will have watched this because there's not a lot else to do in an evening, and it's a program about their experiences. So it's set in a ward in a fictitious hospital called Peacehaven. 6 aircrew with neuropsychiatric problems. It's framed around LMF, but read my paper on LMF, folks. If you've got a medical condition and you're in a hospital for psychiatric problems, neurological problems, you are not LMF, you're a medical case. And there's 6 of them, and they reenact. So again, PTSD folks and flashbacks, they reenact their last Nuremberg operation with the help of an Irk who's put in the same ward as them because they haven't got a bed for him elsewhere, who got frostbite. He takes on the part of the wireless operator and sort of plays along thinking it's a joke, but gets totally involved in this reenactment. They move the beds and the chairs around to recreate the Lancaster. It's definitely Nuremberg. They talk about the long leg. They talk about the Met report, the Scarecrow Shells. There's fighters. There's flak. There's the vapor trails. The H2S is on the blink. The strong winds. A member of the crew's killed, and end up crash landing in Woodbridge. And then the morning comes, and the nurses help them back to the beds. And you get the feeling they're going to relive the event the next night, and the next night, and the next night. Again, it follows these tropes as sort of LMF and scarecrows and the aircrew as the victims rather than the people on the ground. The bombed are invisible again; they're not considered in this. It's as you said earlier. This is during Vietnam and PTSD, so it's all sort of it's all framed around that. What's really interesting is I think that what comes across here, it's not. LMF and that sort of thing is always thought of that they couldn't cope because they were frightened. And what's interesting in this is I think it comes across they couldn't cope because of the grief. They'd lost friends, they'd lost crew members, and I think that's sometimes overlooked. In the sort of reviews and the TV guides of the time, it is very much framed around lack of moral fibre and the nerve-shredding tension of night bombing raids, and the whole clutch of it's better than the whole clutch of stiff upper-lipped movies starring Richard Todd. That was one of the quotes from it. The brave boys, created like livestock, undergo a sustained unnatural assault on their nerve and spirit. And this again, it both references and creates a sort of template for the way the Bomber Command can be remembered by some people. I think it's available on YouTube. I've got a copy of the script behind me, so it's. I'm trying to get a local theatre company to actually put this on at the IBCC next year.
Oh yeah.
So hopefully. So that was the 70s. Those are the two texts that I'm really interested in. Bomber Command in the 80s and 90s. This is when the aircrew were sort of retiring age. It's thank you. It's when they started to form associations and to meet either squadron or station associations and create their own little memorials. And it's like Jay Winter talks about the First World War. There's fictitious kinship groups, people who never actually served together. They served on the same squadron or the same station, but at different points of the war. They then come together with the shared experience. We were all in the same squadron, but they didn't know each other. Again, it's like I've heard people talking about with Masters of the Air. You knew your own crew. It was pointless getting to know anybody else. But in the 80s and the 90s, all these groups, all these associations were created. Following.
Do you think that era, with with the interviews you have in your collection with veterans there, the veterans are now getting by the 80s and 90s to beyond retirement age. They're kind of getting towards the end of their lives. Obviously, there's still a few around now, but people start looking backwards a bit more, start reappraising their lives. Is that when you think some of their own understanding of kind of morality and the bomber war kind of came to fruition, and that, you know, early on after the war they just weren't thinking about it because they were back home dealing with their issues, trying to raise families, etc., etc. But by this point, they've maybe got some time on their hands to start questioning the whole. I mean, when did the Dresden book come out? Would that have been the 80s or 90s?
Do you know? I don't know. I can't remember.
I think it might have been later than that. But I'm just wondering whether there was a particular sort of surge of reappraisal of.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to remember, and I think I'll talk about this a bit later on as well, that there's the veterans, they have their own experience of what happened to them on a particular night in their particular aircraft, and it's very narrow, very focused. 80s and 90s, they're looking back, they're wanting to put their memories into some sort of context, so they do what everybody else would do. They watch TV documentaries. They read books. They do a bit of research. This period of time, you can get hold of the ORBs, the 540s, the station squadron records, you know, so they can see what they did in context. Really importantly, the Bomber Command Association was formed in 1985, and it was them that really got behind as part of their sort of focus on getting national recognition and an official memorial. They started just pushing really hard the bomber commanders being forgotten, and Franklin, who wrote the official histories, he was a navigator in Bomber Command, and he's sort of I've got a book of his behind me on the shelf where he's talking about the process of writing history. And there's a bit of sort of the phrase, "You don't know, you weren't there, man." He sort of says, "Yeah, well, I was there, and I still don't bloody know." And nobody spreads misinformation and rumours quite as much as an association. And I think, you know, some of the we're still sort of living with some of the stories that the Bomber Command Association were putting around from 1985. 92, there's the Canadian Death by Moonlight documentary, which was really, really badly received by veterans in Canada, because basically it said Canadian 6 group veterans were sort of told to bomb German cities by the RAF command, and they didn't really know what they were doing, and, you know, it puts them across a bit as you know, as being murderers rather than being the heroic aircrew doing their job. And Harris Memorial. So Harris became a sort of metaphor for remembering Bomber Command. And when his memorial, when his statue was unveiled, of course, you know, it again divided opinion, and you've got this damn Dresden thing again. So there's this. Are they heroes or are they terror flyers? And yeah, my colleague Heather Hughes sort of says that by the mid 80s, the Bomber Command Association were challenging this official memory by saying that Bomber Command has been forgotten and written out of it. So if you are going to be arguing that you have been forgotten and that aircrew really should be thought of in that they were suffering and they were the victims, and it was like Memphis Belle, will they get back or won't they? Nuremberg is a fantastic operation to focus on, basically.
Yeah.
This is an interesting memorial. It's RAF Wickenby, and the figure is Icarus. So rather than being a sort of grand obelisk and sort of glorifying war, this is showing the horror of it. It's literally a person falling to his death from the skies. I think when was that put up? 1981. That's from. So we're getting there. We're nearly to where we are now. Canadian War Museum 2007. That's really interesting. They had a graphic panel there that told the story of the Bombing War, which Canadian veterans really took umbrage to, and courts and Parliament were involved, and the wording was changed. So, at that period, the veterans and their families had an awful lot of clout. John Nichol's Thin Red Line comes out then. 2012, you get the memorial in Green Park. 2013, you get the Bomber Command clasp, which Johnny Johnson called a stupid piece of tin or something like that. And then the IBCC opened in 2018. That's a composite photo, folks. The length was never that low.
It would have been cool if it had been, but yeah.
Anyway, so if we can go to the next slide, and we'll go back to Nuremberg. So this is a story about Nuremberg from Middlebrook, and it's telling the story of Tom Fogarty, DFM 115 Squadron. He's in a Lancaster Mark II. He was hit by flak and by a fighter. Tried to press on to the target, but was losing height. Bit of a panic discussion. Decided they were going to bail out, and the flight engineer either couldn't find his parachute or it was shredded by shells. So Fogarty, the pilot, gave him his parachute, and that's the bit from the ORB saying that he their aircraft didn't return. The crew all bailed out, landed safely, and were amazed to find the next day or so that they were joined by Fogarty in a holding cell, because, as Middlebrook puts it, he'd put down full flap, switched on the lights, found a field, and done a belly landing. And he came out lying to in the snow, surrounded by farm workers. So the same story is told with a bit more embellishment in John Nichol's book.
Yep.
And if you go to the next slide, my favourite version of the story, it's in Conrad's War. So Conrad is flying a Airfix Lancaster with a plastic navigator and a plastic parachute with his dad and his dog. His dad bails out. He wants to help his dog Towser bail out, but there's no parachute for him except a plastic one. So Conrad gives the dog Towser his parachute and then crash lands. So I've sort of used this point to illustrate the fact that when you're interviewing veterans, they use all these different sources to embellish their stories and to put their stories into context. And each retelling, to a certain extent, changes and becomes a little bit more interesting and a little bit more exciting. And when you get somebody, a sort of celebrity veteran who retells a story over and over again to lots of different people, if something works and a joke lands really well, and then a bit of pathos has the right effect, they sort of embellish the story. Yeah. And they're not so much telling the story that they remember, they're retelling the story, remembering the last time that they told it. So if you can go on to the next slide, I'll not read out the quote from Conrad's War.
Yeah, so people can freeze frame it and read it later. Yeah.
So it's going back to the point. There's this idea that you don't know, you weren't there, man. Sometimes the things that the veteran will tell you about the operation is blatantly obvious, and it's really clear that they have got that fact or that detail or that bit of the story from elsewhere. So there's a quote here from Rusty Warman, who passed away recently, that there's sort of 2 points to this quote. There's him remembering and thinking about his experience and admitting that operation affected him more than anything. And it really had an impact on him, and he goes on to talk about it in a bit more detail. But he also has this bit of information that he wouldn't have known. It was the raid that shouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have known about the discussion as to whether or not that operation should have gone or not. So yeah, in the same way that Fogarty's story has been retold, the veteran stories also bring in this other information from things I've read and documentaries, and possibly the Brylcreem Boys and those sorts of things. And they tell us, sometimes they tell the story because it's what they think that the interviewer wants to hear. The veterans, when they're talking about Nuremberg, will say that more aircrew were lost on that night than in the Battle of Britain, and they will quote the numbers and things, and it's stuff they couldn't possibly have known. So it's Rusty's recollections. He does know what he was talking about because he was there. And he did know that 7 aircraft from his squadron failed to return, and he does talk about how the mental scars were far greater than the physical scars, and it did sink home when he saw for himself the attrition rate. But then again, later on in the interview, he's talking about numbers again. Yeah, sorry.
Because of losses, obviously squadrons are being reconstituted and new people coming through, and so. Is it also a case that in the months that followed, people who weren't even on the raid start talking about the Nuremberg raid because it's become kind of the monster hiding under the bed? It is the horrific raid that is in consciousness. So then that adds to storytelling, or the errors in the storytelling, because people who joined later wouldn't be talking about some obscure raid on, I don't know, a coastal port in 1942 because it wasn't big. But this one, I'm assuming, was big enough for people to discuss. I mean, you could make the parallels in Masters of the Air with Regensburg or Schweinfurt and things like that. The people later on, these raids had got a mythical status.
Yeah, definitely. And the way Nuremberg has been remembered, as I say, is it has built up, and it's built up since Middlebrook's book came out, because Webster and Franklin and the official histories, it's just a sort of footnote to the Battle of Berlin. I mean, I think I don't know as to whether it was talked like that. Certainly, if a crew was lucky enough to be posted to a squadron and survive and do that, complete a tour and were posted away, they might be on that station, depending on what time of year it was.
I'm also guessing because within a few weeks of this, you said earlier on the comment, that almost D-Day saved Bomber Command, is that this isn't some of the targets in Europe were revisited again and again as the war went on. But as you're saying, this is at the end of the Battle of Berlin. Anyone who survived this is moving on to other targets, other campaigns elsewhere. So this one, they never got the chance to kind of revenge for it, kind of thing. Go back there and put the demons to bed. So it allowed it to again build this mythical status. We can think of certain campaigns on the ground, in the air, where they were terrible losses there, and then they go back there a couple of weeks later and everything's changed, and they retake the place very quickly, and it kind of puts to bed the memories of 2 weeks. Oh well, we've taken it now. Whereas this, it never gets fully resolved. Does that make sense?
But also, say the aircrew, if they were on a station, and they managed to survive a tour, they'd be there for a matter of months, and then they'd be somewhere else. And there wasn't really that sort of squadron camaraderie, and they might be talking to other people about a particular operation. But the people who really saw the losses, of course, were the ground crew. There's a chap who was at Waddington, as I say, he lost 8 or 9 aircraft that he worked on. He was there for 3 years. So he probably did. It did become the worst moment. But a lot of crew who survived and came back, they had the debriefing. They were sent on leave. And lots of squadrons had to really regroup, and they needed more aircraft, they needed more crews, and then you've got all this new blood coming in who may or may not have read the papers and talked to people about what the chop rate was. But, so this is an interview with Jeff Gray is a really, really interesting example. He was a farm labourer in Aberdeenshire. He trained to fly in America, went on to complete 30 operations as a pilot on 61 Squadron from RAF Skellingthorpe. A chap called David Kavanagh interviewed him for the archive in 2015, and he was on the Nuremberg operation. His story is fantastic. There's one occasion where he's flying, and the gunners are calling in that they're being followed by at least 2 enemy night fighters, and they've tried corkscrewing, and they're still there, and they're coming in. And desperate measures. The story he tells is he put on full flap. So basically put the brakes on. So the stalling speed of a Lancaster he reckoned was a lot slower than the stalling speed of a Ju-88 or whatever was after him. So they overshot him and went on to find someone a bit easier. But because they'd been trying these evasive actions for so long, the navigator had got pretty much lost, and they ended up bombing what they thought was a searchlight battery near Schweinfurt. And when they got back, the sort of feeling was, we don't really mind that you've bombed Schweinfurt, we're just pleased that you're back. And he talks about scarecrows, and he admits that he saw these things, and whether he thought they were scarecrows at the time, when he was interviewed in 2015, he doesn't pull any punches. He says he's only occasionally saw someone being blown up. He calls them scarecrows as well. I don't know if it's his accent or if it's what he's calling them. But they were known as scarecrows, which was something that we'd invented that didn't bloody exist. We thought it was some German pyrotechnic. No, it wasn't. It was some guy, usually a pathfinder, carrying all the coloured flares. But he discusses whether it was a story that the crews invented or whether it came from top down, and that's the really interesting bit for me. Again, they talk about the cloud cover, and he talks about the moonlight and just about everything that you're going to read about anywhere else. So I think I'm about getting on to my last slide.
I think you are.
Yeah, so it was a mistake. But as Harris says, you have to try things. Sometimes they work, sometimes they didn't. The route was wrong, the planning was wrong, the weather was wrong. The Luftwaffe got it all right. It really hammers home the importance of the need for air superiority. And to say that the end of this was marked the period where Bomber Command nighttime losses were approaching the same sort of daylight losses that the Americans were getting before they got the fighter cover sorted out. The big point really is, I guess, that all new and all recent interpretations and stories about Nuremberg have all been influenced by Martin Middlebrook to some point, or to some extent, and because the history of Bomber Command and the way Bomber Command is remembered is contested history, and it is difficult heritage, and there's these opposing viewpoints. So Nuremberg fits into the argument about dams or Dresden because it's easy to talk about things like Lackamora fibre. It's easy to talk about scarecrows. It's easy to talk about the massive unsustainable attrition rate. And there's this sort of futility of the bombing war from all sides. And I don't think I have a really amazing killer sentence, but Nuremberg is sort of the equivalent. If you're thinking back to Masters of the Air, Nuremberg is the RAF Schweinfurt. It's the one with the terrible losses that I guess because they didn't know that was going to be the worst it was going to get. It's sort of, it has increased as in importance, in the 80 years since the end of the war. And there's this for everybody, historians and in cultural memory, everybody's impression of what happened is influenced by so many other factors. So things like Conrad's War and
Yep.
the Brylcreem Boys are all fed into this mix. And I guess, any future interpretations are going to be changed by the Masters of the Air show. Even if it that's about the Americans, it's still going to affect the way that people start talking about Bomber Command. We've done it now today, haven't we? So
what's the significance of the Three of Spades, by the way?
Okay, so this is Flight Lieutenant Gordon Cruikshank. I don't know if he wrote on the playing cards immediately afterwards, but he flew 52 operations on Manchesters and Lancasters with a couple of squadrons, and every single one of his operations is on a playing card. And the Three of Spades was him recording bombing Nuremberg. Again, that's lifted from the archive.
Thank you.
But the way Nuremberg is remembered, I think it's tied in with these stories of scarecrows and LMF purely because of the way it's been recorded in books and TV shows and veterans memoirs and interviews. The end, I think.
Well, brilliant. I'll just put up your slide there in case people want to get in contact with you, and of course checking out the archive there. But we've got a few questions for you, mostly about the raid itself rather than the historiography, but then people can get, that's fine, as long as we get questions. One from the Great Dominion, we'll go backwards. Did the Met people catch hell from Harris for their inaccurate forecast, or was that just chalked up as part of the vagaries of war?
I think it's just, they did their best. The memory of the war is contested. The Met forecast was contested. So they had one forecast. I think a mosquito went up a bit before the takeoff time and came back with a different story. And I think somebody somewhere decided to ignore that. I think Nuremberg they'd already scrubbed several operations over the previous nights. I think he was just let's go this time, chaps. Obviously was a mistake, but it's easy to say that with hindsight. So
and it's more of a kind of a comment, rhetorical question from Peter O'Connell there. Did anyone ever take the docs diagnosing LMF on a night bombing mission?
No. There were no documents really.
No, the doctors. I think it means the doctors, the actual people.
Okay. Right. So David Stafford Clark became a psychiatrist after the war. I think he was really, really interested in lacumoral fibre. He flew some operations, I think, with 514 from where was he? Waterbeach? No. Some medical officers did go on operations. There's another guy I think went on several ops. I can't remember his name. I've got it, but at least a handful of doctors did. Lacumoral fibre is a whole can of worms that we've certainly not got time to talk
no,
about.
It's worth it. I mean, I've been talking about, it's on my list a whole week about PTSD and cowardice and battle fatigue and all the other words that encompass all those things there and how different units dealt with it or ignored it.
Mary's show was from a couple of weeks ago was absolutely fantastic.
It was on that subject, So a couple more. These two questions are kind of the same thing, but I'll read them. So Ian Carr is saying, did these problematic raids accelerate new technological equipment on or accompanying RAF bombers? And Ian T is saying, was there much of an inquest at Bomber Command HQ? Did they learn anything from the planning mistakes made in the raid? So that's basically lessons learned.
I mean, they were always trying to get one up on the Luftwaffe, and they were always bringing in improvements to the equipment they were taking, and there was very much the war of the scientists. I'm loath to call them sort of backroom boffins because, as we know, the dam busters wasn't dreamt up in a shed. It had all the weight of industry behind it. They were always trying to tweak things and change things and come up with something new. And it's the same as with engine development. They tested on the job. There was no let's test this, see if it works. It's like stick it in an aircraft and see if it comes back or not. It's Yeah, so R&D was very much on the job, and sometimes it was the aircrew that paid the price. And when you can send a bunch of chaps up and 3% losses is acceptable, it's that's what's happening. It's does the changes that you make affect that percentage in any direction? And the Germans were doing exactly the same thing. As I said earlier, they had to really change the way they were responding to RAF Bomber Command after Window and Hamburg, and effectively they got it. Their system worked better than what the RAF were doing, and it was only until some semblance of air superiority was won that the Allies got the upper hand. So I've forgotten what the other question was.
Well, it was about technology and improvements. I think you covered it generally. But my last question for you, really, and we kind of touched on this in the Dan Busters show you did with me last year, whatever the hell that was, is that that you said earlier, we've got these parameters of the dams at one end and Dresden at the other, and I think that they are going to be, that's the playing field we play on. That's how it's going to be for a long time. That's going to be the bookends of how a lot of people look at Bomber Command. Obviously, there's a lot more to Bomber Command. There's other theaters of war that we're not even touching on today. But I suppose at the center, at least that's the reason that brings people in the first place. If the reason they go in the door is because they've just seen the damn buses on the television, or someone's told them that the Bomber Command are all war criminals, you should go and see the museum. That's it. That's the field you have to play on, I guess.
I guess it is. I sometimes wonder if me and James are helping by keep defining it like that. Maybe we should change the terms of reference slightly, but whether that would actually filter down, I don't know. But it does certainly seems to be that way, I think.
I think this is a massive, great rabbit hole, but I think the things that bring people to the subject are TV shows, comics, blah 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 blah, and then it's the big things. It's the Patton Monty rivalry, the whatever, which is the best fighter, which is the best this, and these are the notes that everybody knows. These are the beats that people have about World War II, and I suppose you just got to get them from those to the wider subject. Bring everyone knows, I don't know, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Try and put them onto Beethoven's Fourth or whatever it would be. And that's the challenge, isn't it? Is use these markers as starting points. And that's the thing, isn't it?
So we need to bring people on from Dams or Dresden to Halifaxes or Lancasters or bombing or mining and all those other shows that you've done. So
Well, we will end things there, Dan. It's been great talking to you. And folks, as you know, I'm off for a week to do the tour of Normandy. So we've got Burma and India and Saipan coming up for you when I'm back. And then after that, we've got an Eastern Front week. So keep watching, subscribing, sharing what we're doing. Leave lots of comments afterwards. Go and check out the archive that Dan works at. And I will see you all after the break. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Thank you.